Fantastic.
Privilege for Bonnie.
Thank you. Well, my name is Monica Rodriguez, and I am the Director of Communications and Engagement for the All of Us Research Program at Northwestern University and part of the Illinois Precision Medical Consortium. It's my privilege and honor to be here to moderate our first session today. And today we're going to be looking at research studies that are targeting Puerto Ricans and the Latinx population. I encourage you as we go through this, we have several speakers who are presenting today, and as we go through, I encourage you to leave your questions in the chat. We will go to questions at the very end, so we're going to give everyone their time to present first. And I would like to introduce, first of all, Dr. Lisa Sanchez Johnson. For those of you who are listening over the phone, I'm going to read this bio. As an associate professor and director of the Multicultural Diversity and Latinx Health Equity Research Program and co-chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Work Group in the Department of Family Medicine at Rush University Medical Center. She's also a licensed clinical psychologist and an adjunct associate professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She was previously the director of Bariatric Surgery Research Program and Multicultural Latinx Health Research Program at UIC. Dr. Sanchez Johnson is the founder and chair of the Latinx Health Equity and Health Disparities Special Interest Group in the National Latinx Psychological Association. She has over 26 years of experience conducting research and clinical work with Latinos and other minorities in the area of culturally competent health behavior change. She also has research interests in developing cultural competent obesity interventions and assessments for Latinos and Blacks using community engaged approaches, disparities in weight loss after bariatric surgery across ethnic groups, and cancer, diabetes, and cardiovascular risk reduction in Latinos. With that, Dr. Sanchez.
Good morning, everyone. And Monica, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I am so glad to be presenting to you today and sharing some of my life's work focus on obesity in Latinos and especially among Puerto Ricans. So what I'm going to share with you is really my life's work in terms of a number of different studies that I've conducted in the Humboldt Park area and as far as North Chicago, Waukegan area and numerous other areas in Chicago and also in Hawaii, where I was born and raised. So I will begin with this. Next slide, please. I'd like to start by acknowledging my community partners and also participants. You will see that it definitely took a village to do a number of these studies. I'm going to be focusing on one study in particular that had a great amount of support from the Puerto Rican Agenda, the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, Casa Central, the Association House, the Greater Humboldt Park Community of Wellness, and a whole host of other community agencies, which we'll mention during the methods section, and also to acknowledge a number of different funding mechanisms that help to support this research. A number of them also, in terms of grants, were conducted with co-principal investigators at the Puerto Rican Cultural Center of Chicago. Next, please. So as we saw yesterday, a number of our presenters talked about data from the Hispanic Community Health Study, or the SOUL study. I'm going to cite a few of these findings that are direct relevance to my work. So I tend to study obesity and health risk behaviors. And as you can see in this slide, some pretty alarming rates of overweight and obesity in Latino men. We see about 79% overall. And then also in Latinx women, approximately 78% total in terms of overweight and obesity. When we look at, and the focus of my work is particularly with Latino men that I'm going to share with you today, we can see that, again, if we focus just on Latinx population overall, that it really masks some of the differences that we're seeing here, in particular with Puerto Rican men having the highest rates of obesity using data from the SOUL study. Next, please. So as I am a clinical psychologist and a health psychologist in particular, and what that means is that I'm going to probably be very interested in the connections between mental health and wellness and physical health. That's what I've spent the majority of my work doing. And I just want to say here, in terms of Latinx men, one of the premier books that if you can get your hands on it, was from one of our presenters yesterday. So definitely want to acknowledge that, Marilyn Aguirre Molina. Latina who wrote a seminal book in 2010, focused on the health of Latino men. Yet and still, there's a dearth of research on Latino men related to obesity. And even though we have a number of studies that have been conducted on acculturation and health, there's still a lot of disentangling that we need to do in terms of understanding the role of acculturation and health. I again study obesity and also related issues like physical activity because they're vastly underrepresented in Latinx men. Very, very few, if any, studies that are interventions with Puerto Rican men. And the factors that I study tend to be things associated with obesity like diet, physical activity, body image, and culture. Next, please. So I'm going to just jump in, and I'm happy to talk about the aims of what I'll present today. I will be happy to give any additional details about the study, but they have told me that I have about 10 minutes to present approximately 26 years of work in this area. So I'm going to go quickly and happy to elaborate at some point. So first, I'm going to be talking about some background characteristics of the Latinx men who were in the Latino Men's Health Initiative. That was one of the names of my studies. And also just show you some data that will point to some interesting trends in terms of body image, physical activity, and cultural variables between Mexican and Puerto Rican men. What I have been focusing on, so a lot of this data came from an NIH R21 grant focused on Mexican and Puerto Rican men. We also had a similar study that was focused on Mexican and Puerto Rican women, which I'm happy to talk about that as well. But essentially what we want to do with all of this data, as you can see pointing to the future, is to develop these culturally tailored and targeted weight loss interventions for Mexicans and especially Puerto Rican men because it's greatly understudied. Next, please. So this study and many of my other studies were conducted using a community-based participatory research model. So what this means basically is that we had a tremendous amount of input and review by our community partners. At one point, I was the chair and founder of the Latino Health Community Advisory Board, both in Hawaii, which I initially conducted some work there, and then also in Chicago. So across, and I always mention this because this is not just one study that, even though I'm going to be presenting one study, it's really important to understand that it's cumulative learning that occurs from, a number of different studies that I oversaw. So our community partners were involved in everything from reviewing the measurements to the consent form to selecting the type of incentives that individuals received as part of this study. And then also you might be interested in terms of direct and indirect recruitment. And you'll see we're very successful using these methods. Again, direct recruitment, I want to just, thank everyone so much in terms of our community organizations and our institutions also that allowed us to recruit from either the Puerto Rican Agenda, the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, Casa Central, the Association House, the Greater Humboldt Park Community of Wellness, the Diabetes Empowerment Center, many organizations that we directly were, we were in the fields and you saw us a lot during the time we were doing data collection, and also many other methods of indirect recruitment, like through newspapers, through our community organizations. So we had many individuals involved in this study, and essentially the men, and this is really, I would think this is the first study that really was just, if I'm not mistaken, but really just focused on men and Puerto Rican and Mexican men in particular in this neighborhood. And we recruited individuals who were 18 to 65 years old. The body mass index, so this is a measure of weight also when you consider somebody's height. So we were interested in looking at people that were underweight, normal weight, and overweight, and generally in good general health. Next, please. I know I'm going pretty fast, but hopefully you'll have some questions or feel free to follow up with me at the end. So all of this is published in a number of journals, and I'm giving you some references at the end of this presentation as well to take a look at. So our also, again, heavy community involvement just with the translation piece of it in terms of, we send it to professional translation companies, but you do have to get things translated and back translated. I want to just point out to you here, in terms of body image, because I'll go over that in a second. What we know is that there's very few measures, if any, that are really targeting specifically Latinos. And body image is something important to consider in this context. So body image is essentially your thoughts and feelings about your body. And there's a number of different ways that people measure it. I'm here to say that we definitely need more projects just focusing on things that are more relevant to our Latinx and Puerto Rican community. I did this in one way by offering, having people look at 2 images of body images. There's a popular one called the Stunkered body image silhouettes, where people will be circled what they thought that they looked like and what they would like to look like, and then you calculate the discrepancy between the 2. And then also we showed people images of other types of bodies that were developed more for an African-American population by Pulvers and colleagues, because we're trying to have these type of drawings be more culture-centered. So I'll talk about that if you're interested in the future as well. Men received money to participate in this study in terms of a health and culture interview, a lot of questions asking deep cultural variables related to race and ethnicity. So again, in this study, and as a clinical psychologist and a health researcher, I'm really interested in these deep cultural variables like acculturation and acculturative stress. So acculturation is not stressful for everybody. It may be for some people. And so we measure the stress due to the acculturation process. Also ethnic identity. So this is the degree. You can't just check a box and say somebody's Puerto Rican or Mexican. It often is important to understand how they identify themselves, how strongly they feel about their particular ethnic group. Also cultural values, which we'll see in a second, and biculturalism, which is kind of living in 2 cultures at the same time, and a whole host of other cultural variables. Men also completed a diet questionnaire and also used an accelerometer, which is a measure of physical activity objectively that they wore on their bodies, as well as a physical activity questionnaire that they self-report. And then about 20% of the population sample also completed a qualitative interview. I'm happy to talk about that as well. This asked folks some really in-depth questions about diet, physical activity, and body image, and how to just go about developing these obesity interventions, specifically focus on Latinx men. Oh, next, please. So here's a little bit about our recruitment. So I'm happy to say that many men were interested, and many Mexican and Puerto Rican men were interested in this study. About 435 individuals contacted us. They completed oral consent and initial eligibility. A number of them were not eligible, or they did not continue with the written consent. This is also an important population to study, and we do have their data that they allowed us to hold on to so that we can investigate it later about who actually did not end up in the study, because that can give some important insights as well. But once somebody actually signed the written consent and completed the health and culture interview, you will see here that we had a high degree of retention, so 93 to 96%, which is really good, and it kind of helps to point us into the right direction in terms of doing successful recruitment and retention of individuals in the Chicagoland area, in particular Humboldt Park and the Pilsen neighborhoods. Next, please. So a little bit about, I know that I'm running out of time here, but we just want to focus a little bit on our what we found. So I'm showing you some preliminary data. Now, we have analyzed a portion of this, and I'm going to tell you how you can be involved in this, at the end of the study here. But between Puerto Ricans and Mexicans, actually, there were no significant differences in terms of how they saw themselves currently, in terms of circling the body image, or the body image that they would like to be, or in terms of the discrepancy. So again, this is the difference between how they saw themselves and how they would like to be. And before I go to the next slide, I wanted to just say a second about our population. So you might be wondering, well, who actually was in this study? So I told you about the number of individuals, but a little bit about the sample. So Puerto Ricans were older than Mexicans in general. The mean age was about 44 years in Puerto Ricans. Mexicans and Puerto Ricans also had high rates of smoking in our study. And in fact, the Puerto Rican men that were in this study, when you looked at how they described their smoking status, very high rates at about 46%. And this is, much higher than some national rates. Happy to talk about what we've done to help with that as well. So that's all I'll say about the sample as well. We'll just move forward. Thank you, Monica. a little bit about this. So this was one way of looking at the data, was just to look at the number of hours of television per day, which is a measure of sedentary activity. Overall, we saw that Puerto Ricans had higher rate of a number of hours of TV watching, or higher rates of sedentary activity per day than Mexicans, and also some interesting findings related to not engaging in physical activity. So Puerto Ricans said about 33% did not engage, and same thing among Mexicans. Next, please. Okay, so now I want to just present a little bit about our cultural variables. Since we're running out of time, this is all I have time to present for now. But this is important because as we think about also addressing structural racism, which is definitely a need just in terms of, our neighborhoods and our grocery stores and other institutions that, have much opportunities for growth. I am also more interested in helping people like right now in terms of developing weight loss interventions. And so this is giving us some insights into things that we will incorporate in a future weight loss intervention for Puerto Rican men. So this is showing you that Puerto Rican men had a higher actually degree of adherence to traditional cultural variables like familialism compared to Mexican, and also machismo. So we're going to be including that in a future intervention. Not that we're not going to focus on these variables in Mexican men. We certainly will, because we're very similar, but there were some significant differences. So we might talk about that a little bit differently when we meet with Puerto Rican men. Next, please. So in wrapping up this discussion, I just want to say again that we're going to be infusing some cultural values and all these other deep cultural measurements that we've done in our initial work as we develop an obesity intervention. Again, we will highlight discussions about family and traditional values as well. Oops. I think we're just getting to my slides. I will be happy to share that with you. Also, the family members were invited to attend certain sessions. We're going to emphasize the role of Latino men taking care of their families, because that's highly cultural value and, again, a cultural strengths, and also highlight strategies for reducing sedentary behavior and also increasing physical activity overall. And in the next slide, I have listed some references for you to kind of take a look at. What I want to point out here is that all of our community partners who played a higher level of active involvement are involved in manuscript writing, so writing papers about this. They're certainly welcome and have participated in many, many conference presentations, both locally and also nationally, and also are involved in writing grants either in the past or currently. Next, please. And then I just wanted to wrap up here to say that if you're interested in doing work with Latinx populations, please contact me here. We do have some training programs for individuals, and I'd be happy to talk to you about this. This is data that really belongs to our community. It's homegrown, and we really are looking for people to look at this rich set of data in new and novel ways that can lead to culturally tailored and targeted interventions specifically for Puerto Ricans and Mexican. And again, I have data for both women and men. So please contact me if you're interested in collaborating. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. And I will say you do have a question in the chat, and we may not be getting to all the questions. So if you'd like to respond to the attendees to the question that's in the chat, please feel free. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mercedes Carnethon, who's an epidemiologist and whose research focuses on the distribution and determinants of chronic diseases, specifically cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes, and lung disease. She and her team have described the burden of these conditions in population subgroups defined by race, ethnicity, geography, sexual orientation, and gender identity, and socioeconomic position. With funding from the National Institutes of Health, the American Heart Association, and the American Lung Association, Dr. Carnethon and her team have described the contribution that behaviors such as sleep, physical activity, and diet play in the development of outcomes of chronic diseases. Over her 20-year career, she has authored over 300 publications that appear in leading scientific journals in the fields of medicine and public health. With her institution, Northwestern University, Dr. Carnethon serves as the co-director of the Center of Education and Career Development and the associate chair of the Appointments, Promotion, and Tenure Committee. Her research findings have been disseminated broadly through major print, local, and national media. Presenting alongside her is Kristen Dr. Kristen Knudsen, whose PhD research focuses on the association between sleep, circadian rhythms, and cardiometabolic diseases, including diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular disease. She focuses on real-world assessments of habitual sleep patterns and collects detailed clinical measures of biomarkers of disease risk. In addition, her research examines whether sleep and circadian rhythms partially mediate socioeconomic and/or racial ethnic disparities. Thank you to you both for being here. Please feel free to begin.
Great. Thank you so much for having us. We're really excited. I'm going to start off presenting, sharing a little background, and then I will turn it over to Dr. Knudsen, who is the MPI of this project that we're really excited to share with you. Unlike the prior speaker, we are not quite at the point of having results to share, but the purpose of us speaking today is to really get you excited about what we're doing so that we can spread the word, because we really want to engage the Puerto Rican community in participating further. Next slide. So the reason we even proposed this research study is that through years of research, much of which has been led by Dr. Knudsen, we've observed disparities in sleep. Habitual sleep, reflecting how long one often sleeps in a given night, sleep disorders, common sleep disorders that many of us have heard of, such as obstructive sleep apnea, as well as disrupted sleep and sleep that is non-restful, so poor quality sleep, waking up after a night of sleep and feeling as though you never even shut your eyes. And then also disorders in sleep timing. I'm sure we all know somebody who says, I can't go to sleep until 2 or 3 in the morning, and then I can't wake up before noon. This reflects circadian rhythms, and some people have shifted circadian timing for when they perform the expected activities of sleeping, eating, being physically active. And unfortunately, the reasons for these differences and disparities that we see in sleep by racial groups, by ethnic groups, by socioeconomic groups, isn't completely explained. We hypothesize that they're due to a number of different social factors that are different between the groups, socioeconomic factors. We think about differences in the ways in which people work and the types of jobs that they have. Also the neighborhoods and communities in which they live, how quiet or restful they are, and the extent to which social factors in those neighborhoods, including factors such as crime, may lead to psychological distress that keeps one up at night. Next slide. And at the same time, we have also observed disparities in cognitive function, or how our brain works and how we think. The rates of dementia being a severe form of cognitive decline. We've often heard of Alzheimer's disease as a form of cognitive dysfunction. The rates of cognitive decline and dementia are higher in Black and Latinx adults as compared with white adults. These patterns are also reflected by socioeconomic status or resources. So one's financial strength, their education levels. These are some of the socioeconomic factors. We also see similar patterns whereby those with fewer resources have higher rates of cognitive decline. And prior research has shown that inadequate sleep is a risk factor for cognitive dysfunction, dementia, and Alzheimer's disease. In fact, right now, there's a lot of news buzz around a study that was recently published, a very large study in Europe, demonstrating that those individuals who slept for less time each night had higher rates of cognitive dysfunction. What that study doesn't do, that we're aiming to do, is actually describe the relationships among race, ethnicity, sleep, and cognitive decline. And that's why we proposed a study that we sought funding from the National Institutes of Aging in order to test our hypothesis that disparities that we know are present in sleep could underlie these racial and ethnic differences in cognitive function. Next slide. And so we're fortunate to receive funding from the National Institute on Aging, which is one of the National Institutes of Health, so that we could propose a study to understand which psychological, social well-being, and clinical characteristics are associated with sleep disparities, and to determine whether inadequate sleep mediates or explains a proportion of the racial and ethnic differences in the change in cognitive function over time, so over 2 years. Next slide. And so we formed this study that is a 5-year observational study, which means that we are not doing anything to participants. This is not a randomized trial, but we're actually just observing them in their natural living environment. We are not intervening. We're going to collect measurements of sleep using what we consider to be the best practices or gold standard in the field. And we're going to measure cognitive function across multiple different domains. So how one's executive function, other elements of cognitive dysfunction that all make up how one thinks and responds to their environment around them. Because we understand that trying to determine the temporal relationship, so the relationship in time between these two factors is important, we're going to measure sleep once at baseline and then again 2 years later to see how it changes over time. And the most critical goal, and one in which we've engaged Dr. Giacello to help us with and in making connections with the Puerto Rican community here in Chicago, is that we're enrolling equal numbers of white, Black, and Puerto Rican participants so that we can make comparisons among these groups. Next slide. And so, the question comes up, why are we specifically focusing on Puerto Ricans? And that's because I think a little bit of what you heard earlier, Hispanic and Latinx is too broad of a group with too much heterogeneity in underlying risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, underlying socioeconomic and cultural factors. And one thing that we have observed so far is that Puerto Ricans have an earlier age of onset of Alzheimer's disease, as well as more severe cognitive impairment as compared with non-Hispanic whites. And then we also were building upon data that we saw from the Sinai Urban Health Institute, indicating that Puerto Ricans in particular reported more cardiovascular and metabolic health problems, namely diabetes and hypertension, than Mexican Americans. And we think that one of the reasons that we see higher rates of Alzheimer's disease in non-whites is because of disparities in these cardiovascular and metabolic risk factors. And finally, we're building upon data from the Hispanic Community Health Study that you heard about yesterday. And in that study, research was demonstrated that short sleep was most common among the Puerto Ricans, and that the association between sleep disordered breathing and hypertension was strongest among the Puerto Ricans. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Knudsen for the next set of slides.
Thank you. So I wanted to just describe in more detail what it is we're actually asking participants to do. And I do want to point out that since the COVID pandemic began, we did rearrange the order of what we do and where we do it to minimize how much time a volunteer needs to be in our clinic at Northwestern. And so this figure kind of reflects the current design, which begins with a variety of assessments that happen in the home, including filling out questionnaires. We have a variety of questionnaires on sleep, of course, on health, on social factors, and people can fill these out either online, over the phone, or on paper. After the questionnaires are completed, then we send to them these devices to assess their sleep. And so we have 2 devices. One is called a wrist ActiWatch, which is similar to a wristwatch or a Fitbit, if you are familiar with those. And participants wear these for 7 days. And this is an unobtrusive way to get a good idea of sleep patterns, both sleep duration and sleep quality, as well as the timing of sleep. As we mentioned earlier, that the timing of sleep also seems to matter. And then on one night, we asked participants to wear what I'm just calling a head device. And that's the picture you can see on the top. And this device includes something you wear on your head, as well as a nose tube, some chest belts, and a pulse oximeter. And the point of this is to give us an estimate of sleep disordered breathing or a measurement of obstructive sleep apnea, which is a common sleep disorder that's related to cardiovascular health and cognition. And so it's an important thing to assess. The device also gives us some idea about sleep stages. So if you've heard of REM sleep, this device gives us an idea of how much REM sleep a participant has. But we only ask people to wear this for one night. After the sleep assessment's complete, we will schedule them for a clinic visit at Northwestern, and we have it divided between two different spaces at Northwestern. The first is the preventive medicine clinic visit. And I should say this 2 to 3 hours is actually not correct. That was the original amount of time participants would spend in the clinic. We've reduced this substantially by having questionnaires and the sleep assessment done prior to the clinic visit. And all that occurs in the clinic visit at preventive medicine is a clinical exam. So this includes, typical clinical assessments like measuring blood pressure, measuring height, measuring weight. And then we also take a blood sample that should be fasting. So we do ask volunteers to come to the clinic before they've eaten anything for the day so that we can measure things like blood sugar. The second part of the study asks participants to go to the cerebrovascular research laboratory, which could be done in the same day or on a separate day, whatever is most convenient for the participant. And that is where we do a variety of cognitive tests, as Dr. Carnethon described. And then in addition to that, we take a couple other measures. One is called transcranial Doppler. And what that is just using an ultrasound, it's non-invasive, to measure the blood flow in the brain, because we do think that blood flow is related to brain function and cognitive function, and may be related to sleep. We also measure gait, because it's been shown that how somebody walks is related to brain function and cognitive decline. So we ask participants to walk across the room, and then that is measured to see what their gait looks like. Then, as we mentioned, we ask participants to come back. We invite them to come back approximately 2 years later. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, we are trying to get participants from 3 different racial and ethnic groups. Our goal is to get a total of 450 adults who are 65 years of age or older and who are community dwelling. That is, they're not living in fully assisted living facilities. And we want 150 from each of these groups: non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic Black, and Puerto Rican adults. And we're using 2 recruitment strategies to try to enroll participants. The first is what we're calling the neighborhood-based sampling design. And what this entails is sending letters to addresses that have been selected in specific neighborhoods known to have a high proportion of at least one of these racial and ethnic groups. So of course, Humboldt Park is one of those neighborhoods. So if you get a letter, now you know why. But in addition to the letters, we are also engaging in these partnerships and developing partnerships with community groups to help us identify study participants, as well as, have events where we can describe the study and explain the study in local neighborhoods rather than expecting participants to come straight to Northwestern without actually understanding the nature of the study. And so this is a key aspect to developing community-based research. And I think Dr. Sanchez-Johnson already described this a little bit as well, that this is a key aspect for engaging different communities in research. And next slide, please. So this is where we were at prior to COVID. So we did suspend the study in about March 2020 due to the COVID pandemic, and we are just now starting up again. So these numbers are the numbers of enrolled prior to COVID. And you can see on the left, the number of Black and African American participants was 26. 12 of them were women and 14 of them were men. We had 41 adults identified as non-Hispanic white, 17 women, 24 men. And then we had 9 Puerto Rican adults, 4 women, 5 men. And so we really are working with communities and Dr. Giacello to really identify ways to engage the Puerto Rican community. Because as Dr. Carnethon described, this group is at risk, and others have described, have greater disparities in many of the things we're measuring, including sleep and cognitive function. Next slide, please. So I want to end by just sort of saying, what is the point of this research and what do we hope to come out of it? And I think, historically, there have been studies that would go into a community, study them and leave, and the community would never hear again. And that is not the best way to study, to do community engaged research. One of the first, we consider this to be really the first and largest study to test these hypotheses about sleep and cognitive function as it relates to disparities in non-Hispanic Black and Puerto Rican communities. And so we feel that we will ultimately get really significant and important results from this work. And in particular, by describing findings in these 2 underrepresented racial and ethnic minority groups who do have a higher burden of disease, we hope to identify behaviors that are amenable to intervention. So it isn't that we just want to see, are there associations? We want to ultimately be able to take that information to improve the health of these communities. That is an ultimate goal. And we can't assume that what we see in non-Hispanic whites is going to work in all communities and all racial and ethnic groups. So by including these two underrepresented groups in research, we'll have a better idea of which characteristics of sleep are related to cognitive function in Puerto Rican older adults or in African American or non-Hispanic Black older adults. So we really do want this study to be a starting point for engaging with this community, to develop later studies to explore these findings further, develop interventions, and spread beyond just cognitive function, look at cardiovascular disease and other health outcomes that may be important to the community and may be of concern. And next slide. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact either myself, I'm in the middle, my colleague, Dr. Carnethon, particularly if you want any of the references that that we described in the background, or even just the general study. We have our general study email that you can reach out to as well.
Thank you so much, ladies. Again, if there are questions in the chat, please feel free to answer them directly. If not, we're going to move on to the next one. I'd like to introduce Dr. David Marquez, who's earned a doctoral degree and master's degree in kinesiology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and a bachelor's degree in psychology from Loyola University Chicago. He's a professor of kinesiology and nutrition and the director of exercise psychology laboratory in the College of Applied Health Sciences at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He's also a visiting professor with the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center. His research has focused on reducing health disparities and developing physical activity interventions for vulnerable populations. Dr. Marquez spends a majority of his time working with the Latino community, older adults and individuals at risk for Alzheimer's disease. His areas of expertise are in health disparities, health promotion, and gernatology. With that.
Excellent. Thank you for the introduction, Monica, and thank you for the invitation to be here to speak with you today on this really important topic. My hope is that by the end of my time in speaking, you will see how the things that have been brought up by the previous presenters in this session are highlighted and associated. You know, we're all working in health in different topics within health, and so our talks are related, not by chance. If you can go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to give a little bit of a broad overview. I'll talk briefly about a couple studies that I have been a part of and led with older Latinos in the Chicagoland area. And sometimes we are able to separate the data into data from older Puerto Ricans, from say older Mexicans, but it depends on the numbers that we have. If you look at the United States, you might have heard about the graying of America, right? This demographic shift of now there are more older adults in the United States than ever before. And this is true, and this is supported by the data. So if you look at a time period of 2000 to 2009, there was a 10% increase of older non-Latino whites in the United States. Okay, that's a big increase. But if you look at the relative increase of older Latinos in the United States over that same time period, it was a 59% increase. So of course, the absolute number of older whites is going to be larger than older Latinos due to the population, but the relative increase is significantly higher amongst older Latinos. If you look at more recent data, in 2017, Latinos were 8% of older adults in the United States. By 2060, that's projected to be 21% of older adults within the United States. So from a research perspective, people are there and people are willing to participate in research. If we, as the research teams, make it so that people feel confident and comfortable in participating in that research. We can't be blaming people for not participating in our research. It is on us to create that welcoming environment for people to participate in research. Oh, no, I was trying to advance. Next slide, please. ADRD, Alzheimer's disease and related dementias in Latinos. So you heard from previous presenters, about an increased risk and prevalence of Alzheimer's disease amongst communities of color. But did you know just how bad it is going to get? This was data presented several years ago, projecting the number of Latinos in the United States with Alzheimer's disease in 2060. The red line is one that you might want to focus on. That is the total. The other lines are breakdowns by specific ages of older adults. The number of Latinos in the US with Alzheimer's disease is projected to increase by 832% by 2060. So this was not broken down, by Mexicans and Puerto Ricans and other people of different cultural heritages. But overall, we know that there are high rates and they're really increasing in Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. Why? Well, there are numerous reasons. A lot of studies are ongoing as to understand why, but you heard about sleep and how sleep is related to cognitive functioning. You heard about obesity and chronic diseases from the SOUL study and the high prevalence. And these are being related to Alzheimer's disease as well, to factors that increase the risk. So these are things that we really need to study more to learn more about them so that we can help our Latino communities. So next slide, please. So we have to get out into communities and do community engaged research. And I recommend that anybody doing the work follow some type of model or framework. I really enjoy and advocate for the NGAGEDD model. This is from colleagues of mine in the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center, Drs. Crystal Glover and Raj Shah. And I won't go in depth about this, but if you look at the first couple letters, the N in engaged is to network, right? We can't and we should not expect anything upfront, right? It's to network and to gain trust. And we also do this by giving first. So a lot of stuff in the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center, we give presentations, we provide PPE supplies during this pandemic. In what ways can we help people before doing that third part, the A, to advocate for research? So we are transparent, right? Like we are about data. We need data from different communities of color, specifically in my case, older Latinos, so that we can learn more and help us to learn about ourselves in Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. But we can't just expect people to participate, right? And then we give back. And then over time, we can include participants or former participants in our actual formation of studies. All right, so this is a type of model that's done. Next slide, please. 2 lines of research that I have led. First is with Latin dance. And so myself and Miguel Mendez, who owns and operates the Dance Academy of Salsa, over time in speaking to people, many people know Miguel because he's been around for a long time. Was in the Puerto Rican community in Humboldt Park for just until very recently. So he and I created the BAILAMOS Latin dance program for older adults. He brings the dance experience, I bring the science. I don't know a whole lot about dance. I'm a terrible dancer. He doesn't know quite as much about science. So we make a really good team together. We've been working together for about 12 years, I believe. Why dancing? You know why dancing, right? Unfortunately, there's not a lot of research studies into if people regularly dance, what kind of health benefits might come from this. There's data to show that people, older adults that engage in walking, improve their cognition and their health. Well, what about something like dancing, where you not only have that increase and sustained heart rate, but you also have the cognitive challenge, a challenge that's greater for some people like myself, to actually remember and execute these steps in response to a dance partner. Some of us, like myself, enjoy traditional exercise, but many people don't. So we just need to find ways to move our bodies. And when you speak to people about dancing, many Latinos, many Puerto Ricans, dancing is fun, it's enjoyable, it's social, there's music. Whereas traditional exercise, well, that's boring, right? Okay, so let's find ways to get ourselves to move. So we've had various forms of funding. Next slide, please. And I'm not going to go through, I actually don't have any results here to present, but we conducted a really big trial in 12 different parts of Chicago and neighboring suburbs. And about 15 to 20% of our sample identified as Puerto Rican. But it wasn't enough to separate our results by cultural heritage. That said, the trial did result in increases in physical activity and did increase different forms of cognition, such as memory, okay, different aspects of memory and cognition. So again, this is a trial that was done with community dwelling, like the DISCO trial, out in the community, people that did not have any type of cognitive impairment yet. Next slide, please. The other line of work is out of the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center. So I am fortunate enough to lead the Latino Core of the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center, and that's funded by the National Institute on Aging. Next slide, please. So why do we have a Latino Core? Why are we focusing on Latinos? Well, first off, with Alzheimer's disease, currently, the only way we really know if somebody had Alzheimer's disease when they were living is through autopsy, right? So we cannot currently measure those same things in living individuals, although we're getting there with technology. Very few Latinos participate in research where there is a request to consider brain donation. Interestingly, those that we do have are largely out of New York, and those are of Puerto Rican descent. But in general, there is almost no data from the brains of Latinos. Next slide, please. So we've been conducting the Latino Core study since 2016. So we are recruiting those who identify as Latino, Hispanic, Latinx, mostly people identify as a cultural heritage within that, like Puerto Rican, 60 years and older, who do not currently have dementia, and willing to consider organ donation. It is not a requirement. And to date, we have recruited 244 Latinos into the study. 76 have agreed to donate their brains when they pass away. So it is not a mandatory requirement of the study. And about 15 to 20% of our current sample identifies as Puerto Rican. And this is an annual study. So every year there's 1 day of testing. And so we can see over time, what are the factors that put Latinos at risk for Alzheimer's disease? And also, what are the factors that might be protective? What types of cultural factors might actually protect Latinos from developing Alzheimer's disease? Next slide, please. So why are Latinos donating? Largely, it's two things. It's personal, it's family, personal or family, and the altruism that we see in Latinos. I knew somebody, I have a family member who had Alzheimer's, and so I want to contribute to helping to find a cure. I don't want my future, my children, my grandchildren, my future generations to have to deal with Alzheimer's disease. My father passed away from Alzheimer's disease about a year ago. It is truly a terrible, horrible disease. And so we need data with Latinos, from Latinos, as was previously discussed, so that we know that findings actually apply to Latinos. Next slide, please. So I thank you for your time. Here is my email address and my Twitter handle. If you are interested in following up with me about specific results or something like that, I'm happy to do so. So thank you.
Thank you so much, David, and to all the speakers. We do actually have quite a bit of time to be able to answer any questions. I will start with the one that was in the chat just for those who are listening via phone, tuning in via phone. That was originally for Dr. Sanchez-Johnson. Is there any information on obesity, eating disorders in the Latinx and trans non-binary community? Do you mind sharing your response? You are muted.
Sorry about that. Yes, thank you so much. And thank you so much for that question. I did back channel the person that asked that question. I'm happy to also share that we definitely need more research in this area. Thank you so much for bringing that up. In my own study, I do have some data on this, but not nearly enough. And we haven't started to analyze that data because of the smaller sample size. But we know from previous studies that there are, higher rates of eating disorders in LGBTQ samples compared to other groups of individuals, and also with eating disorders. So both eating disorders and obesity. Some of the studies also have looked at Latinos as well. And one of the studies that I cited, I can put in the chat box to share with others some good references in that area as well. So thank you so much for that question.
Great, thank you. Thinking about, and this for any of the panelists who are currently doing research, thinking about the impact that COVID has had on your current research projects. Could you speak to maybe some of the adjustments? I know, Kristen, you, Dr. Knudsen, you alluded to it, but what are some of the impacts that this last year has had on your current research, and how have you pivoted to make changes to adapt?
Yeah, I mean, I can follow up on that a little bit too. Like, as I mentioned, we sort of rearranged, but there's some aspects of our study that have to be done in clinic, and we're still, we haven't resumed that yet because we want to make sure participants are comfortable, particularly since we're looking at older adults, right? So these are 65 and older. We don't want to try to rush them into the clinic until we're certain they're comfortable with that. Regardless of which group we're talking about, I think it's really important to be cognizant of how our volunteers feel about coming into the clinic. And so this is what we're navigating right now and figuring out how best to move forward.
And I just would follow on to say that early on, we didn't want to be part of contributing to the problem of the stark disparities in severe COVID and COVID outcomes by encouraging in-person participation. So we're considering different hybrid models, things that we can bring to people via the internet, ensuring that individuals are comfortable using internet-based data collection methods, or that the health literacy levels of our materials are appropriate for the audience if we're going to ask participants to put sleep equipment on their own. And so, what we're very hopeful that as more people become vaccinated, that we can ideally get people to come in and join our study in person.
At Rush, we have an added barrier in that for the Latino Core study, we do data collection in the participants' homes. So now we're trying to figure out all of these that the two professors have mentioned, definitely issues for us as well. And it's about safety. And so research is not as high on the priority list, nor should it be. However, we do, as a society, we end up hurting from that, right? Because then we don't have results, we don't have findings, we don't know, there's not as much new information that's generated because we couldn't because of the pandemic. So it is our current reality. And so we also deal with that. We try to do some things via the telephone. But for example, like my dance programs, I don't have anything going on right now. It'd be much more difficult to do a dancing remotely, or part of so much of that is the in-person, the touch, that kind of thing. So it definitely affects the research.
Yes, thanks, David, for mentioning that. And I can add, from my perspective, even though these studies are completed, we are actually in the process of looking for funding. For those of you who know me, I'm always looking for money, and we are always coming to our community asking for letters of support. So thank you so much for being patient with that. In our current iteration that we're seeking funding for an obesity intervention for Puerto Rican men, we are proposing to do something very novel, which is a telebehavioral health intervention This is going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. We're hoping to do at some point some pilot investigations to see if this is acceptable to our men. Again, usually when funders are looking to fund something, they're looking to see that you've already done this in a very small sample, and then we'll give you some more money. Because of all of this is new, we really don't know. And if this is going to be attractive to people and in what aspects. So we will still bring men in, invite them in to do some physical measurements. But it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out if it is funded, and to see how acceptable that is. And maybe we'll have also another group that will not do it remotely. So, different interventions are attractive to different groups of individuals. So this is where the flexibility is needed, and the community's input is highly, highly valued, because they know what's happening and what people are doing in their own communities. And so we can draw from that as well, because many community organizations are having also remote sessions for whether it's diet or mental health or physical activity. So even though we may not be doing it from a research perspective yet, there are a tremendous amount of community lessons that can be shared with individuals to develop such studies. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. Looking at, all of you in some way shared the reality that there is gaps in research when it comes to Latinx populations, but as well, it seems across the board that your research is already showing trends and affirming what is already the disparities that exist. What would you say how do we influence a change in the policies, and what does each of you believe the next steps is or are?
I'll jump in because I'm, right, on the cusp of trying to get something funded. So first of all, just in terms of funding, I think just the overall increases in knowledge like this summit is trying to do to get the word out. It is very difficult to, convince grant reviewers in the short amount of time that you have on a piece of paper of why this is needed, but to, really put a national landscape on this is critically important. So first, just increasing awareness from a policy level, if this could really be taken to action in terms of funding agencies to fund smaller studies and larger studies, and to understand that with Puerto Ricans, Latinos in general, men in particular, in terms of my own work. So, we need more money in this area. We also need more people just doing this work. So from, again, policy perspective, training programs that are specific to Latinx individuals or focusing on Latinx work. I've gotten some of this funding for training Latinx obesity and cancer health equity scholars, but we need more in this area.
And I would add that, having studies and having data to show policymakers, look, this is important, here are the numbers, is important. But really, I think what sways policymakers more are the community members themselves, whether it's a patient population or whoever. So the combination of partnering between the scientists with the data and the numbers with somebody who's actually affected, like a real person or people, and coming together to speak with policymakers to try to impact policy and direct funds in certain directions is really much more impactful.
And I know sometimes it can be hard for people to understand why it's important to participate in observational research studies, because one of the things that we clearly state in the consent form is that there is no direct benefit to you for participating. But I would argue that these observational studies are the critical first step that we need so that we can identify the associations so that later studies can be designed to intervene upon those modifiable factors that we think could work to improve health. And so, this is a critical first step. So we really encourage you, if you have connections to older adults, to reach out to our DISCO study team. We can be reached at disco@northwestern.edu, or by looking up either of our names and emailing us. Thankfully, Dr. Knudsen and I have fairly unique names, and we might be the only people in the Northwestern directory by those names. Or if you connect with any of the study organizers, you can put them in touch. And if there are opportunities that you have for us to come talk with large groups of people about our study, we would love to come out in person or virtually to be safe with our study team to discuss our study.
Did you want, Dr. Marquez, did you want to comment as well on the policy aspect?
Yeah, I agree with all of this. And there's also, people who are doing health policy related work, right? That's what their training is in, that's what their education is in, that's what their work is in. So ensuring that they are aware of our research as well, right? So like I myself, I wasn't trained in policy or health policy, but that doesn't mean that my work cannot influence health policy, right? It's like has been said, notifying, making sure that legislators know about the research, making sure that the health policy researchers know about the work that might be more, at the community level, so that they then have that information and can maybe transmit it more successfully than, say, somebody like myself who's inexperienced in that area.
Fantastic, thank you.
Monica, may I jump in and just also reaffirm something about the training aspect of it that I mentioned? And I'm sure, my co-presenters can attest to this as well. If you are doing work in this area, you will get contacted on almost weekly basis. This is wonderful, by students, whether they're high school students, college students, graduate students, even community members that are interested in work in this area. Even though I said that there's a lot more work that needs to be done, we do have data from our communities, whether it's from the SOUL studies that people can join us. I'm one of the co-investigators, and I know folks on our panel here also have used a lot of the SOUL data. We also have individual data that people can use in terms of investigating this. And I'm here to say also that you don't have to know how to do this research. If you just, I can speak for myself, if you're just interested in this, but don't know where to begin, it's the right call to make in terms of contacting us, because we can either point you in the right direction or help to train you to be able to answer a specific question, like the question that I got about, trans and non-binary individuals. Great question. We can begin to look at things like that. But again, it starts with also providing some incentive, whether it's collaborations on papers and conference presentations, or just funding that we can offer these individuals who might be interested in this work.
Thank you, Dr. Sanchez-Johnson. As we close out the hour here, I did want to ask and go back to a comment that Dr. Carnethon had brought up regarding health literacy. Do we have an idea what the current health literacy is amongst Latinos, and how has the COVID-19 exacerbated possibly the digital divide and their ability to grow and learn how to even advocate for themselves when it comes to healthcare?
I think for the healthcare and patient visits, and we mentioned sometimes there's telehealth, and we're finding that that there are a number of older adults and older Latinos who have no idea necessarily how to do a Zoom type of thing, but can be taught, right, and want to learn. So with instruction, those kinds of things can happen. Now you have to back, okay, does the person have like a smartphone or a tablet or something like that? But there are situations that are making it such that, people can, anybody from a segment of the population can communicate in these ways.
Would anybody else care to comment?
I wish I did know more about it. I think certainly more work is needed in this space so that we can tailor things appropriately. One of the principles that I think we always adhere to is to always approach people with respect, not approaching people with the thought that they don't understand, but really asking questions to confirm understanding and to engage in discussions about the type of work we're doing and why. Just because our work is only useful and valuable if we have people who are willing to come to the table to participate.
Thank you. Thank you. Fantastic. With that, we have, I would like to encourage you that we do have another workshop that is coming up after this. I want to thank again all of our panelists and those of you who submitted questions. The PowerPoint, the deck that was shared today should be made available, and all of the contact information for each of the panelists will be included, so that if you do have further questions, you can feel free to reach out. I will hand it back over to the team, and thank you again so much for joining us today. Day 2 of the Puerto Rican Health Summit for those of you who are just tuning in now.